Hi, everybody. Want to start just by acknowledging one change in program. We initially planned to have this be a view of two states, election administration in two states, but the Secretary of State of Wisconsin, who was going to attend, was unable to make it. So it's just going to be Brad Raffensperger, which is just fine because it's hard to think of anyone who played a more high-profile role in this space than Brad Raffensperger. As Michael Kank said in the previous segment, election administration has largely, certainly in much of my 40 years of covering politics, been kind of a technical subject that didn't get a whole lot of attention. But changes in our politics and particular events that have happened have added a huge amount of drama to it, both inherent in the closeness of elections that we've had, but also in the conduct of individuals who've had to implement election laws in a very tough environment. Robert Caro, the great biographer of Lyndon Johnson, wrote that power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And I think that we all got a revelatory moment about Brad Raffensperger in 2020 with the release of that tape that showed him getting pressure from the most powerful person in the world to do something that he thought was wrong, and he resisted the pressure. He didn't do it. And so I guess my question, that's to your credit, obviously. My question for you, since we're trying to provide some guidance to younger reporters who cover this subject, as they are interacting with elections officials in their states and localities, how would you advise them to discern when somebody is simply implementing the law in a faithful way, scrupulously following the regulations, and when is somebody trying to twist it and produce a particular outcome?
First of all, I would recommend that you become a subject matter expert. In Georgia, we actually had two people. One of them is here today for Georgia Public Television. The other one's AJC reporter. But they just kind of dove into, election law. And then we also had a very major change in elections. When I took office, we introduced and passed House Bill 316, which allowed us for the very first time to get new voting machines with a verifiable paper ballot, and also gave us authority to be able to join a multi-state organization that would share voter records with each other so we have clean voter rolls. And that's the organization called ERIC, Electronic Registration Information Center, and some other things. But those are the two big lifts that we had coming into 2020. And so these two gentlemen, they really knew the law, and they also knew some of the underlying issues that we had before, to making sure that we could work on short lines, as was mentioned earlier, all that. But I would say becoming a subject matter expert so that you really know, what the law is and then what we're trying to do. And then obviously rolling into 2020 was a COVID year. I think that was a once in a century thing. So I don't think we'll be facing that in 24. We'll probably have other issues, but that won't be one of them.
Well, let me pick up on that. It was a COVID year. That was a unique situation. But as we saw, and you called it a vindication in the Dominion settlement with Fox, a vindication of the validity of the results, you oversaw a fair election in the state of Georgia. And yet, the Georgia legislature, after that election, passed a law that made changes to the process. It's a lot of elements to that law, but some of them changed aspects of voting that seemed to have been successful in 2020. Why should people not look at that as an indictment of the Georgia system? Why was that law necessary?
Well, when I took office, we got House Bill 316 passed, but there were a lot of issues or questions that we had coming into office. One of those was actually signature match for the absentee ballot process. Many people don't realize we've actually been sued by both political parties. Republicans and Democrats have sued us, and they're saying, both of them said that it was subjective. Well, I'm an engineer.
Which ones had better lawyers?
Well, they both were, we were spending taxpayer dollars to push back on that. And so what is an objective criteria? And so with SB 202, we went to photo ID for absentee voting. and it's modeled very closely to what Minnesota has. Now, when I go on my Rotary and Kiwanis talks, which is bipartisan, nonpartisan, we love everyone, I can share that. Now, when you go to talk to a Tea Party group, you might also let them know that they're doing the same thing in Nebraska and Kansas. But the point of that is that it's an objective way of updating, having absentee ballots because you're using driver's license number, it goes back to photo ID, and really elevated security, but also elevated voters' confidence. And normally, I'd like to add that, under a normal circumstance, if we didn't have 2020, voter confidence wouldn't be a very important issue. I know we have to have accurate and fair elections, but you have to shore up voter confidence. And you say, but that was all based on a lie. Now we have to shore up confidence. Well, when enough people believe it and you don't have trust in the election, you have to just figure out what can we do, go belts and suspender beyond the line to make sure that you can shore up people's confidence in that. Because I know that in the history in Georgia, there was time when people didn't trust the results a long time ago. They thought the system didn't favor them. They wanted fair and honest elections. Well, coming out of 2020, for whatever reason, and we proved all of that was made up, but we need to shore that up. And if you can do that objectively and you do not impinge people's right to vote, so photo ID, then we thought that was a very important thing. Also, Mark Elias talked about lines. I have on my phone here the 2020. We actually kept lines. The average wait time on Election Day in 2020 was 2 minutes in the afternoon. I'm not saying it was at 7 a.m. because you always have those early morning glitches. In 2022, the average wait time was also about 2 minutes. And the reason that we did that, to answer Mark Elias's question, the counties run the elections. But if you have long lines in a county, who do you think wears that? The county election director or the Secretary of State? And I don't mind wearing my own mistakes, but I'm not going to bear the burden for someone else's. Plus, as the Secretary of State, we do believe in being voter-centric. Keep those lines short. You know, we have a place in Georgia, it's called Chick-fil-A. And everyone hates those lines on Monday because they always seem so long. And so they have figured out how to keep those lines short. We have figured out how to keep those lines short. And what we do is we actually work with the counties saying, how many people do you have in this precinct? How many voting machines do you have? You can't get that through in a day. Add more machines or bust the precinct in half. And we've had great success during Election Day, keeping those lines short. So those are two really key things that I supported. Now, some of the other stuff, when I do my Rotary meetings, I will maybe not talk about that because my job is to follow the law and implement what the General Assembly passes. But photo ID, keeping lines shorter than an hour is great. And we actually now, by and large, have it under 30 minutes.
Let me push back a little bit on or explore a little bit on the trust question. Some of our colleagues at earlier panels were making the point that reporters shouldn't necessarily just interview the people who show up to the rallies because they're the most active, the loudest. They should look for other places to get people who are not so attached to political campaigns and more regular people. You're talking about making changes in the name of restoring trust, and that's from the people who are claiming the elections aren't valid. But why doesn't high turnout, both nationally and in Georgia in recent elections, why doesn't that stand as evidence that actually people do trust the system?
Well, to that point, that is true because we had record turnout. We also have record people being now registered in the state of Georgia. So we've hit both of those marks. I think we've actually bounced that the soft spot of being accessible and secure. And I think that really has elevated voters' confidence in the process. To trusted sources, throwing out names, but we found that Professor Charles Stewart from MIT is just an objective person that really looks at the data. So we've been looking at researchers as we look at what are the best practices. And so we also look at other states. What are they doing in some of the other states? And if we see something that's a little bit better, then we look at how do we implement that in our state. We would like to be the model, and that's why we've been recognized by independent organizations and on both sides of the aisle for really being at top for election integrity and election accessibility. They can be mutually beneficial, and they also can work together. They don't have to be on opposite ends of the spectrum.
one of the advantages of having covered this stuff a long time is you can see the long arc of these stories. And election administration, it's really about who signed up to vote, where can they vote, how can they vote, when can they vote, how are those votes counted. And over the course of my career, that has gotten more and more liberalized, easier and easier for people to cast an absentee ballot without a reason or to vote early. Ben Ginsberg talked about the fraud versus suppression industrial complex. That liberalization of the system has occurred over a long period of time, and there haven't been any credible, widespread allegations of fraud. If that's the case, why shouldn't reporters covering election administration look at everything that raises a barrier to voting, a complication to voting? Why shouldn't they interpret that as voter suppression?
Because you're really looking at least I am, I'm looking at how to improve the process. Because after Bush v. Gore, I think anyone that's of a certain age, so anyone that is under the age of, I don't know what that would be, but Bush v. Gore, I think, singed into everyone's mind that you didn't want to have hanging chads. And so what do? So we come up with electronic voting. And that's what our former Secretary of State, Kathy Cox, implemented, electronic voting without a verifiable paper ballot. But it's electronic voting is a different way. But then people say, well, how do you know that the machine really accurately recorded that? People wanted a paper ballot. So now we've kind of hit the best of both worlds. Yes, you can record your vote. It's scanned, through electronic means, but now you can do a 100% hand recount like we did in 2020. You can do audits, risk limiting audits, which really Colorado has pioneers, but other states are using. And it gives people confidence in that. So I think the system's always improved. We have no excuse absentee voting, which was put into law by a Republican governor. 2005, Sonny Perdue did that with a Republican House and Senate. And then we added now Senate.
That's been good. That trend, as I indicated before, has been going on for a very long time, both parties.
And now we have 17 days of early voting. So we give voters the choice. We're not pushing them any which way. And we think, with the additional requirement that counties have to keep lines shorter than 1 hour, that's a voter-centric measure, and it just really has the voters have confidence in the result, but also enjoy the experience of voting.
One of the challenges that I felt as a young reporter, and that I think many of the young reporters here are going to deal with, is the challenge of recognition. What am I looking at here? There are sometimes changes that are made in the administration of election that have good reason, but the reporter covering it may not know what that is. For example, election administrators do have to purge voter rolls every once in a while, right? You've got to find people, you've got to clean up your voter count. On the other hand, a too aggressive approach to that is actually going to disenfranchise people who should not be removed from the rolls. How do you tell the difference between those two things?
Well, in Georgia, we know what has been actually gone through the scrutiny of the courts. And if you look at what we do, is we remove people when they die, when they pass away, and so we can do that immediately. But when people move from state to state, that is kind of an issue. And one of the things, the biggest issue we have right now is federal law. And you have to understand, when the Republicans had the House, the Senate, and the presidency under President Trump, they did nothing on election reform. And here's what has happened since NVRA was passed since 1993. Americans have become even more mobile. And so people have done studies that 11% of all Americans move every year. We have 7.7 million registered voters in the state of Georgia. Multiply that by 0.11, that's 800,000 potential Georgians move every year. And federal law says that 90 days before an election, you cannot remove anyone. So that's 200,000 voters that could have moved in this state. So did they move around the state, out of the county, out of the precinct, and did they move into another state? So those are the kind of issues that we have. And so we want to do that objectively. And that's why we joined ERIC, which is now being attacked by some people on the far right for whatever reason, because I like clean voter rolls. Why would you attack the only multi-state organization that's available right now to make sure you have clean, objective voter rolls?
Is it not obvious to you that in one of the examples that Mark Elias cited, that the movement across states in red states, to make it, to change the rules by which college students vote. Is that not obvious to you that that represents a political party trying to reduce the number of college students who vote?
Well, I just can talk about my state. And I guess,
I'll take that as a yes for other states.
and I'll take this that this dates me somewhat, but I just really appreciate the job and a great admirer of President Ronald Reagan. And the thing about Ronald Reagan, he was the first Republican that wasn't afraid of voters. He thought that everyone was going to, vote for him if he talked to them long enough. And so he was always trying to grow the party. And so I never have been afraid of voters. I think that you have to go out there and engage voters and have a compelling, positive message. And when you do that, you win elections. And in spite of all of the misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies that we had, thrown against us after 2020, that's what I did. For a year and a half, I went to Rotary, Kiwanis, and those are the only folks that would have us in, and I had a nonpartisan, bipartisan speech, but just engage people. But in that crowd, there were people that were very conservative, and that was their opportunity to ask questions. I went to Republican Party meetings, Tea Party meetings, anyone that would invite me in, because I figured I need to engage voters. And that's what we need to do, is you engage students, they will support you if you have a message that is relatable to them and that really was going to do something for them. And that's what voters are looking for. What are you going to do for me in my position? And then people have to make that decision. Voters are smart, and I've never doubted that. And I think 2022, I think they did a pretty good job.
As reporters look ahead to 2024 and try to figure out what are the most important stories to cover, is it fair to say that a conclusion that can be drawn from the 2020 race and the fights afterwards is that election fraud is a non-story?
I think that we've shown that there is that tension. In fact, I wrote an article in National Review about, the myth of voter suppression and the myth of voter fraud. Because if you look at the United States of America, we're actually very good at running elections.
But aren't they not comparable things? Isn't voter fraud really a myth, and voter suppression is a little bit more of a mixed bag?
Well, the history, obviously, of voter suppression, that, we have, a really sordid history of voter suppression.
Right now, though.
But now what you see is people are, I think, it's a fear-based thought that you want to somehow, discourage some people from voting. I want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to vote. And so in Georgia.
You do, but there are people in many states who don't.
But what you found is in all of the swing states where you had people that stood for the rule of law and made sure we had honest and fair elections, those are the folks that won in 2022. Now, when you have a state that's 70-30, 80-20, I get that. And that goes both ways.
One of the things that the two former party chairs, Reince Priebus and Tom Perez, said last night when David Axelrod was interviewing them was that national elections, are run now on very small margins. And, a few, maybe 100,000 people in the country may settle the race. With margins that tight, does that mean that covering election officials and what they do is approaching in importance what candidates and campaigns do? Because what election officials do can move votes on the margin.
I guess I've always had faith in my election officials. I know that we have an investigation division in our office to look at any single allegation that comes forward, but they take an oath of office. And I know that in our 159 counties, yes, we have a lot of counties in Georgia, in 159 counties, that everyone take an oath of office to do their job. Don't look left or right, just do your job. Walk that line of integrity. And I feel that they do. Now, sometimes some of them are more competent than others, and that's why it's very distressing for me when people quit early in their career because of the pressure that they're getting, because when they have 10, 12, 15 years of experience, that's tough to replace. But it is one of those issues that I think we work through. I think that what you're seeing is that the election denier myth, the election denier, I guess, way of going at politics isn't effective. They're losing, and eventually they're going to realize they're going to get so tired of losing that they find a strategy that works. And that's engaging voters and being voter-centric.
How big an obstacle to efficient and effective and fair administration of elections, and therefore how big a story, is the fact that many people, volunteers who've manned tables at polling places for a very long time, that they're intimidated by the atmosphere and the potential abuse and even potential violence that they could face in doing that. How big a story is that to you?
I'm really excited to say in Georgia it's not. And I think that's really because my governor and I, we stood up and we pushed back and we engaged and we kind of moved past that. And yet I did a town hall about 6 weeks ago in Phoenix, Arizona, and the people that were brought in, I thought I was living in, November 15th, 2020, and they didn't have that, the ability to move forward, even though it's Maricopa County. It both is controlled by the Republicans, and they've been fighting and pushing, making sure they have fair and honest elections, but it just didn't change there. But that's a situation where the election deniers have not won, and that's the consequences of not telling people the truth. The truth matters. Integrity counts. It always will count, because I just believe, I'm not Pollyanna, but I believe that most people are good. And I really think that if you just lean into that, they're going to do the right thing.
Help reporters see the forest as well as the trees in the big picture. Mark and Ben both talked about 2020 as being a year that really turbocharged the issue of administration of elections and whether it's done the right way and whether votes are counted the right way. How far do you think we have come since 2000, after which there was a consensus among many, many people that we needed a better system? Is it a much better system now?
Absolutely. Over 90%, 95% of all ballots that are cast in America right now have a verifiable paper ballot. So you can do a 100% hand recount of the county commissioner, state rep, or the president of the United States and find out exactly what that is. When you have a paper ballot, you can do risk limiting audits. So from that standpoint, it's really good. You have an organization like ERIC, so you can update your voter rolls objectively. So that's something that's really good. So we're in a much better place. Like I said, I think that federal law needs to be reformed so that you can remove people that don't live in your state anymore, up until that time, maybe perhaps 30 days. So if you can put them on at 30 days, you can remove them at 30 days, as long as you're part of an organization that is multi-state and you're doing it through objective measures.
Now, in a narrower frame, how far have we come since 2020? And I offer this piece of evidence. I personally found it encouraging that though there were many election deniers running in 2022 in the midterm elections, nearly all of them, when they lost, conceded the races. Do you think the notion of intense protests of every adverse election results, is that a tide that is going out, that's receding? How big a threat do you think that is right now?
I think the tide is going out. I think people have figured it out. You all figured it out, your voters. You voted for what you wanted in 2020, and that's what the results were in our state and other states. And that's what you did in 2022. We have fair and honest elections. I think people are realize it's not a winning strategy, and eventually the people in the political parties are going to say, that's not a candidate we want to put up if they're not going to concede. That's why the Carter Center put out, we would actually, we would go abide by the results of the election. I figured if I'm back in the kitchen and, I'm making the meal for the day, should be willing to, eat what I cook. And so that's why I said, I trust our elections. If I lose, I lose. If I win, I win. And it just happened to work in our favor.
Before we take questions from the audience, and I'm going to invite people to go to the microphones and be prepared to ask questions. I just want to ask you, how do you assess the way people in our business, journalism, cover the issue of election administration? What do you think we get right? What do you think we get wrong?
I really believe in Georgia, and I guess it's, some days, that almost, I shouldn't be saying this friendly things about the press, but I think our press has really been treating us fair.
Is that just Bluestein and Murphy, or?
Oh, there's other folks, Georgia Public Television, but what it is they all ask hard questions, trust me. And they get zingers at me from time to time because they don't agree on this or they don't agree on that. But what they're doing is they're trying to dig into the truth. And I think we have a very active communications department. We don't, run and hide from the press. We're out there. We're engaging the press. What are you hearing? Why do you think that? Well, let me put you in touch with. Come on behind the curtain and come up to our elections office and talk to our state elections director, see what he's doing. So we have really an open, transparent process with the press, and we think that really works well because it allows us to build trust. They'll call us out if we aren't being truthful. And so we want to make sure that we are truthful, give them the information so they can make their informed decision. And we just feel like it's worked out well for the people of Georgia.
Where have we got questions? Where do we start? We got some over here?
Sure. Hi, I'm Max Cohen with Punchbowl News. I was curious your thoughts on the high-profile incident when the MLB pulled out their All-Star game from Atlanta over the voting law you were discussing. What's your takeaway from that incident and what happened later on with the 2022 elections in your state?
Well, number one is I wish they would have called me, the corporations. No one called me and said, okay, Brad, what is this bill SB 202? Glad you asked. I'll be down in 20 minutes. Come by, and I'm going to go through this point by point, bring my general counsel. We never got the opportunity to explain to them. Because if you really look at it, we actually increased the number of days early voting. We were alleged that we were actually reducing the number of days early voting because there was a dead bill out there that someone had filed. We have an objective measure, which is photo ID for all forms of voting. We allowed people to vote any way they wanted to. I could explain every single issue. And so that's what happened. But the best revenge is that we won the World Series that year.
We've got a question on this side.
Hi, Ariama Long. I'm with Amsterdam News up in New York City. And so while I was in grad school, I got to work for the Associated Press, and I did data entry on election nights, which is cool because they give you like candy. You have to stay up all night. But we get these calls from reporters in precincts in like Georgia, Texas, and whatnot. And something that I learned about normal elections, I wanted to ask you about. So there's a certain amount of human error that happens, like someone leaves a polling machine on the back of a truck, or someone gets locked out of a polling place, and it happens. It's not necessarily malicious. How do you deal with that from so high up on a state level, just like on a daily basis, but also do you think that that's kind of on a small way part of why people have an issue with voter confidence or fraud or suppression?
I know that when the polls closed and they buttoned it all up, that every once in a while that there's supposed to be 2 flash drives and maybe they don't get back to county headquarters. I know that sometimes there's maybe some ballots they're still back there at the precinct. They didn't take those out. And so those are the kind of things that happen. But that really gets rectified pretty quickly because when you show up to vote, people, there's a number of how many people showed up that day, in the poll pad. Then when you actually use, in Georgia, our ballot marking device, it actually records how many people use that machine, so you can get that number. Then at the end, you're also then counting your number of ballots. They should all match, but so then when you get back to the county headquarters, if there's something that happened, you'll realize that quickly. But that does happen, and that means you get a deputy, go back out with the election official, open up the school, open up wherever that was, and get that information to the county. But sometimes it takes till the next morning. But by and large, it's relatively small, and if you look at it, it was never of any total that would have ever affected the results that we had in Georgia, and probably not any other state.
Hi, my name's Haley B. Miller. I cover Ohio politics for the USA Today Network. You mentioned ERIC, and Ohio is one of the states that's made the decision to pull out of it. It's a very niche issue. What's your pitch to kind of the average voter, the average person, about why this conversation is important and relevant to them?
I think voters need to understand that in Georgia, when we update our voter rolls, we do it objectively. So we do get death records, but also when we get information that you've moved to a state that's a member of ERIC, let's pick Oregon or Minnesota, and then you register in Minnesota, then we don't immediately take you off the voter roll. We then contact you and say, have you actually moved to Minnesota? And if they come back to us immediately and say, yes, I did, then we can take them off immediately. If they don't, then we just put them in this bin over here, which we know you're in Minnesota, but you haven't responded to our mailing, but we just then put them on that list, kind of to see if they truly did, but we know that they have. But it's just an objective criteria, and we think it really helps voters have confidence in that, because I think people, and actually federal law requires you to have accurate voter list, and that's the best way we found to have that.
Hello, my name is Michael Lackenmeyer, and I'm a student here at the University of Chicago studying history. I'm wondering a little bit about the history of Georgia's recent elections. With all the controversy that happened during Brian Kemp's race against Stacey Abrams the first time, with him being the Secretary of State, do you think it's appropriate for secretaries of state to run for higher elections while they're still serving in their term? And how do you think it impacts people's perception of the office when that happens? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Because coming out of the 2018 race, Stacey Abrams, that was one of the issues that she raised. And if you really look at the Trump campaign and all of their lawsuits and all their allegations, they were the flip side, or they copied almost word for word of what came out of Stacey Abrams' group. Because Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State, and then he stayed in office for a period of time, and then he actually, resigned, and then Robin Crittenton did that little 6-week period between them, myself taking office. In Arizona, Katie Hobbs was the Secretary of State, and she was then finishing up, but she did not step out of office, but the same logic. And now all of a sudden, the Republican side is saying, well, what's going on there? But you have to understand the office of Secretary of State, we are not counting anything from directly counting, I guess I should say. Because the work starts at the precinct level. They report those results, then it bubbles up to the county election office. And the county, all 159 of our counties, send that office up to us. And that's what you're seeing on election night reporting, is the county results that we just collect, collate, and then put that out there. And so the Secretary of State can't do anything and affect that part of the results. And so that is just something that people throw out, typically from a losing candidate side, to try and come up with, a false, charge. It's not anything that really would matter to the results of the elections.
Let me just follow up. We don't elect justices to the Supreme Court. Is there an argument for people involved in election administration, both at the local and state level, not being elected at all, being career professionals?
No, I've always, when I was in the State House, always was strongly opposed to unelected boards, commissions, and authority having all this undue influence and sway. And when it comes to your priceless franchise to vote, I think that person should be elected, because then you can then decide if you want to reaffirm them in 4 years, and then reaffirm them and they get reelected, or you tell them to find another job. And so I think that elections do have results. Elections is the total accountability standard. So I actually support that. When you have a state election board, you kind of wonder who's in charge and who do you get mad at. And well, I was appointed by this other group of people, and it just diffuses the responsibility. And in effect, I think you end up with Washington, D.C. at your state level, because nothing happens in Washington. No one's accountable except the president, who is almighty, and he's got all the power, right? So that's the kind of issue that I don't want to see happen at the state level.
Well, to that point, are you concerned about the corruption of the process in Georgia from the provision in the new law that was passed that removed you as head of the state election board?
I've been very clear I did not support that provision of SB 202.
What consequence do you think that's going to have?
Well, I think it just diffuses, really the ability to hold someone accountable and then ask, well, when are you going to get to that? And whereas me, they're going to come and I am responsible. I report to the voters.
But do you think we're going to get to a situation where in some counties, the election board is going to summarily change election results in a way that you wouldn't have tolerated?
Well, they can't change election results. There's no way that would stand the scrutiny. First of all, when they change result, I couldn't certify that because I know it's been changed. So that it stops right there. Mm-hmm. Then the governor, he's not going to get my script.
So you're still a backstop, even not as the head of the board.
Exactly.
Hi, Zaria Oates, ABC 24 Memphis. So we have an administrator of elections who's very good at getting back with me, and she'll interview and whatever, but recently there's been issues with residency requirements in the mayoral race. I think she understands that she did something that she probably shouldn't have, which was ask for multiple legal opinions on what that law looks like, and waited until she got the one that she wanted and then picked that one. And so anytime that we talk to her about that issue or anything relative to it, it's not that she dodges the question, but she doesn't give any kind of answer that moves the story forward, I guess. So I guess my question is, who else do you recommend can give the answer as to why, other than her, even though she's the one who's kind of making that decision to take that legal opinion? And if not the voters, who else can speak to that?
I would say probably your Secretary of State of Tennessee. So he'll probably be calling me tomorrow. But we know, we're part of an organization called NAST, National Association of Secretary of State. So I know most of them. And even though we're maybe on different sides of the aisle, in Tennessee we're on the same side, we all get along well. But I would then call the Secretary of State of Tennessee and just ask him for clarification on that.
Thank you.
Nicole Nixon, I'm with Cap Radio, which is the NPR station in Sacramento. There's a county in Northern California that recently voted to end its contract with Dominion. That's probably going to cause a bunch of problems, including the county may have to count all the ballots by hand, hire over 1,000 new workers to do that. Just wondering, from your perspective as a state elections official, what you think of that, the problems that might cause, and then how can journalists over the next few months think about this and report on it in a way to make sure that voters know what's going on and make sure that their votes get counted in the primaries?
Well, that's just an unfortunate outcome of that huge disinformation campaign. If that county would have waited a little bit longer for that recent settlement that happened a week and a half ago, then they may have put a pause on that. But that said, that is a push. People want to get rid of machines, and they want to go back to. They talk about they want people to be able to vote hand marked paper ballots, but their end game is actually they want hand counting. And the problem with hand counting is it's a lot slower and it's not as accurate. And we have people, county election directors, that remember those years in Georgia. And they said, we were here till 3 o'clock in the morning. And these are counties with less than 10,000 people, and they're there till 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning. I would just, you report on it, and then you have to ask people, how did that work out for you? And then I think when they see what the results are, I think people are going to start saying, well, who came up with that idea? We fortunately have a statewide system, and I'm really grateful that's the way we've done it in Georgia for 20 years now.
As reporters prioritize what issues to cover in election administration, knowing systems and secretaries of state around the country as you do, what do you see as the weakest link in the system nationally?
The weakest link
In the system of recording and tabulating votes?
I think that we probably I really feel comfortable where we are in the process of in Georgia about voter registration. Then we have our machines that we do a ballot marking device, and we made that decision. Actually, I'm one of the people that spoke towards that, because there's a big debate about hand-marked paper ballots versus ballot marking devices. Former Secretary of State Kathy Cox, who happened to be a Democrat, liked the ballot marking devices. So did the General Assembly. That was my preference. And she said that way you're never questioning what their mark was. But that vote is marked, then it's printed, you can verify it, you put it in the scanner, we verify the scanners, then we can do a forensic audit of the machines afterwards. So it's all checked, triple checked. So I feel really good about that process. The biggest issue really is the disinformation. It's candidates who, and their consultants.
The weakest list,
Is
the
the
weakest
candidates-
link is trust.
Is trust, and that's due to the candidates, and then their consultants. See, and there's probably not a lot of political consultants here, and I've only ever had one, so I'm not going to get them mad at me. But the issue really is these consultants don't want to admit that their candidate lost because that means I'm a bad consultant. Yes, well, you should have ran a better campaign for your candidate, or your candidate shouldn't have said some dumb things that he did. But those are the consequences because the voters are smart. The voters sift this all out. They're going to get it right at the end of the day.
Let's do one last question. We're getting almost out of time. Over here.
Hi, my name is Jamal Andrews. I'm a reporter with Scripps News, formerly Newsy for anybody. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about formerly incarcerated individuals who go to vote. In Florida, there's obviously been this controversy about those folks being arrested for fraud. And I believe in Georgia, it was your decision to allow formerly incarcerated folks, even if they haven't paid all their fines and fees, to vote. I'm wondering what went into that decision, and what do you make of places like Florida who have these laws that don't allow felons to vote, or if they do, make them pay all their fines and fees prior to voting?
We worked with the Attorney General's office, and they had an opinion, a ruling. That's the Department of Laws, and we followed it. But in Georgia, it's very, I believe, fair, is that once a felon has served their sentence, then they're done, and their rights will be restored. They don't have to go before a tribunal or anything like that. And if there's any fines and restitution, that does not delay them getting their rights back. And so we lead on that, and we think that's the appropriate way.
All right, I'm going to ask one final question before we wrap up, and that is that we all know that President Biden, for a year or two, has made an issue of the threat to democracy in the country. And he has identified that threat as coming from extremists within your political party. Do you think that that is a fair framing of the system? That is there a genuine threat, in your view, to democracy, or is that overhyped? And if it is genuine, is it coming from the direction that President Biden says it's coming from?
I think one of the things that's frustrating from my perspective is that Stacey Abrams, she lost by 55,000 votes in 2018. And I went out after I wrote my book. It's called Integrity Counts. I saw there's another speaker that got their little plug of their book, very, very sly like that. It's a bestseller, but it has so much truth in it they can't handle it. But anyway, she lost by 55,000 votes. So when I go on these talk shows and then I start talking about that, and they say, well, are you trying to say that that's the same as what President Trump did? No, he was the President of the United States of America. She was running for governor. Of course, it can be ramped up to a whole different level. But if that side of the aisle does not hold their people accountable, and they're pointing over here, this side of the aisle is just tuning them out. This side of the aisle needs to hold their folks accountable. So it's really us up to clean up our house, and I'm speaking as a Republican, and for Democrats to clean up their house. So when Stacey Abrams or anyone else says, oh, what about, and they come up with all their excuses not supported by the facts.
She did not say, however, that votes were fraudulently cast or fraudulently calculated.
But voter, as Ginsburg said, it's voter fraud, voter suppression. It's just, the different sides of the same coin. It's really decreasing people's confidence in the election results. And where that takes you, it starts pulling apart our social fabric. And that is not healthy for America. And so we need to really confront people that are just trying to tear apart, our social fabric and not accept the results of the election. I think I've done that in Georgia. I think my governor has done that. So we've done our part.
Thank you for doing your job, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.